Hello and welcome to Transition Tea, the podcast dedicated to demystifying the world of healthcare transition and activation planning. I'm your host, Kelly Guzman, the president and CEO of Yellow Brick Consulting. And today I am honored to have Debbie Wayne joining us. So Debbie, welcome to the podcast. And can you provide our listeners with a brief background about you?
Yes, thank you for having me. This will be fun. I have been a nurse for 50 years this year.
Oh, wow.
Yeah. Retired though at this point. I just work per diem, which is just fine with me. I keep in touch, but do you want me to go through how I started? Or?
Yeah, definitely.
Well, I became a nurse sort of by accident. I really wanted to be an interpreter at the UN, but I couldn't afford to go to college. So then I said, well, what else can I do? And my mother was a nurse. So I said, okay, well, I'll go be a nurse. Of course, my mother was mortified because I was always the first one who fainted at the first sign of blood. But as it turns out, I loved it. I've never looked back. I think it's the best career ever. You know, you can do so many things, and I've done a variety of things. I started out working in Philadelphia, where I went to school at Jefferson, which was a big teaching hospital. And I worked there for a few years, and then they threw me into a head nurse role. I didn't really know what I was doing with that, but I learned it. And then I said, oh, my new grads are learning more than I am. I better go back to school. So I went back to school, got my bachelor's. Then I moved to San Diego, finished my bachelor's, and worked registry so that I could get some experiences throughout the community, because I'd only ever been in this teaching hospital. So I wanted to see how that was. And got thrown into a lot of different situations, a lot of new clinical. My first job was orthopedics, and I've kind of kept that all through my career because I happen to like it. But there, when you work for the registry, you go everywhere. And so that was really a good experience, work different shifts, different hospitals, etc. And I decided I would go back for my master's degree, and I needed to still work. So I took a job in utilization review, which really helped me learn all the payment systems for hospitals and how they get paid and how patients have to deal with all of that. So that was a good experience. Then finished my master's and went back into nursing management at a community hospital, and also did some service line development, which was interesting. It turned out that we decided not to do the program, and so then I left and went to UCSD. So then I spent the rest of my career at UCSD, which was about 27 years. Started in Hillcrest, did my first job. I got there, and the director of nursing at the time says, well, I have to give you another unit because I just removed the nurse manager of that unit. And I was rooming with her. So that was kind of interesting. But it was kind of a mutual. And then about 2 days later, she says to me, oh, and by the way, I want you to take the neuro intermediate unit, which of course I had no experience with. So I learned that, which was great. And really spent most of my time in med surg, got those units coordinated, spent some time trying to look at practices across the various units and make sure we were getting the same standardization, because we were kind of all over the board with how we floated people, how we assigned people, those kinds of things. So, and then I said, well, I'm doing this role, maybe I better get paid for this. So I proposed having a director of med surg, which was only the second one. We had one for women and infants, but that was just the second one we had. And I did that for several years, went through lots of opening, closing, merging, unmerging, starting a new unit, starting a new service, all that stuff. And also a big financial crisis at the organization. So we had layoffs that was really the worst thing in my career I've ever had to deal with, was the layoffs. As it turns out, I personally didn't have to lay that many people off because we found jobs for them, but it still was really, really dramatic, really was very difficult to deal with, and the staff. So there was a lot of change management, a lot of communication that had to go on with that. And we ended up with really me, no assistant managers, and a CNS for about 6 big med-surg units for several years.
Oh, wow.
So that was difficult, but we started kind of our first shared governance model there. We had, teams on the units because they had to manage. They did their evaluations with, against each other. And so it turned out to be okay. And then finally we were able to add back some additional people because the quality did start to suffer a bit. We couldn't do a lot of the things that we really wanted to do. And then about 2004, the director of nursing up at the La Jolla campus, which was our experiment for community hospital that turned out not to really work that well. We ended up using it, having residents, interns, and it was a full teaching hospital by the time I got done. But to begin with, that director left and they needed somebody to fill in. So yours truly got to fill in. Wasn't too happy with it at the beginning, but once I got there, I saw the staff was great and it was very different. You had to work with the physicians more and the community more. And I turned out to be the only administrative person up there for the most part. So I had to deal with the risk management issues and the customer service and the labor. And that's when I kind of mostly learned about the regulations, because whenever anybody from the California Department of Health showed up, I was their escort. And so, yeah. And I also learned at that point, I had the operating room and the emergency room and the ICUs, which I had never had any real experience with. So they weren't under my direct, I guess, authority, if you want to say that, but everyone was all connected. So all your patient flow issues, your operating schedule, your staffing, all that had to be worked out together as a group. So, and then let's see, the big highlights thereafter was the opening of the CVC, the Cardiovascular Hospital, so to speak. That was in 2011. I think that's the first time I met you.
That's when we met.
Yes. So, so that was great. And, no real big highlights after that until we decided to open up another facility because we were really impacted with beds. So that's when we started planning the Jacobs Medical Center. And I was involved with that until I retired. And even after I retired, I came back for about 6 months to finish it up.
I love it.
And then I retired.
And here you are. Wow. That is
50 years later. 50 years later. Yeah.
Amazing trip. And you look fabulous. So, I always tell you you're my idol because I want to just mimic the things that you do. What's really funny, and I didn't know, is like my mom told me to become a nurse as well. And I wanted to be a marine biologist and really be a dolphin trainer down at SeaWorld. But that didn't work out. So I did the same thing, went to nursing school and was planning to go back, because I actually really didn't like it very much, but then fell in love with nursing when I was getting my bachelor's degree, because I realized it was going to take me 4 years to get a bachelor's degree instead of 1. And I was like, I'm just going to get an MBA. So it's amazing the things that you learn and you can do in nursing. So I do think it is the greatest profession. So have a definite love for it. So today, I forgot to mention, we were drinking the Sleigh Ride tea, and it has from David's Tea, which is my personal favorite. We've got fruit and spice. And then the one thing I thought was interesting is beetroot, which kind of is a little different flavor, and then some like popped rice. So
really taste the beetroot, but I guess it's in there.
It's in there, yeah. It really is delicious. So, all right. So we're going to go ahead and talk transition. So we heard about your first job or your career path, but it sounds like you did a lot of little mini moves along the way. So what was your experience in, in preparing for those like merges and, transition from, one unit to the next? What was the experience like?
Well, sometimes it was, hurry up, we have to close this unit because the census is low, and then it never opened. So there was that scenario. And then you just had to figure out your staffing and getting groups to merge and, dealing with all the feelings that go along with, loss of a unit. Sometimes it was planned. And so we would be adding or merging units for better management and efficiency. But there again, you had to deal with staff and other departments and how they interacted and that whole change process. So that really is the theme of all of them. It's always about change.
Mm-hmm.
And how do you get different people, different groups working together to come up with a better solution, or it might not feel like a better solution, but it's something that has to be done for a financial reason. And how do you keep the patient really in focus so that you're doing the right thing for the patient as well as the staff. So that was, and then once we decided we were going to do subacute unit because we had a lot of patients that we couldn't get placed into nursing homes. And so we went through that whole looking at all the regulatory, doing an assessment, how many patients, a big financial assessment as well. How are we going to get paid? Is it going to be worth it? Is it better to just leave them here? Would it be better care if we kept them together, or is it better to spread them out like we've been doing, that kind of thing? And we were just about to open and the regulations changed, and we had remodeled the whole unit and gone through. We hadn't hired any staff yet. We did hire a manager. That poor, she ended up getting a different job in the organization, but we decided not to do it. And so then we opened that unit back up with new group of patients and new group of staff. And so it was on a small scale, really very similar to what we would do on a bigger scale.
Yeah.
Sometimes with less thought, I have to say, and sometimes with less impact to other departments. There's always some. So you always, like, if you're adding a new unit, you've got to worry about your environmental services, your pharmacy, all your departments that support the practice of nursing and the patients, and you have to work with them. But it's just on a smaller scale than when you get into a big facility or you're opening up a 54-bed hospital.
No, it's a great point, because we talk about host departments, and those are the ones that are moving, or the big people. But then I had such a huge appreciation of all of those support departments that make the unit run. The facilities, the EVS, the linen, the laundry, the supply chain. So getting all of that coordinated definitely is a big change. So you mentioned change, and I do think that that's a common theme. And then loss. That was a big aha for me, that I always thought, like, okay, we're moving to this other space. It's going to be great. It's going to be exciting. And I remember the first time I was in a department when they were crying because they were going to move to, like, literally in this horrible space to this gorgeous space, but they weren't going to be by their friends. They were going to be in different spaces. So do you have any strategies that you use that you felt like were the most effective from a change management perspective to help people deal with and to anticipate what those changes would be, and how to really, like, cope with the loss?
Well, in the beginning, when you're doing your assessment of it, especially if you're planning a new facility, the more people you can get involved in the planning of it and looking at the design, if they have the opportunity to be involved, sometimes that helps. Sometimes they're angry enough that they don't want to, but if you at least offer and, try to get them engaged and say, okay, this is going to happen, so let's talk about how we can make it happen easier for you. Or, for instance, when we opened up the Cardiovascular Center, we gave people the option of moving. We didn't force them to move. So, they could apply for the jobs. And unfortunately, some people were going to lose their job if not enough people went up to the other facility. And we made that pretty clear, so that if there was somebody who really felt very strongly that they did not want to move their practice up to the La Jolla campus, which is, for some people, it was a big hardship because they're 20, 30 miles away. There's a lot more traffic. They live south of Hillcrest. So, it would be a hardship for them. So we helped them find jobs before the actual move happened. So they wouldn't have to be disadvantaged if they were on a unit that was moving. And we always think the census is going to drop on those units, and it never does. So when we went to CVC, the Cardiovascular Center, we anticipate the census at Hillcrest would drop like 50%, never dropped. So of course we dropped the staffing 50%, and we had to hurry up and hire people. So that gets people low. But getting people involved, letting them be part of the planning, have them work on the committee if you can, and if you can't get them on the committee, at least maybe have them be a champion for the unit for communication. That helped. So
what about you talked about people who they don't want to go, but say people who are wanted to move into the new facility, but you didn't have enough room for that PICU, or you didn't have enough room for that extra med surg unit, and now you have the haves and the have-nots. I know we tell our staff to say, it's not the new and the old facility, it's the existing facility, and whatever the name of the tower project is or something like that. How do you deal with the people who want to leave and feel like, well, how can we have all this, old space and old equipment? What about us? How do you deal with those staff?
That was a big problem for us to manage with Jacobs, because there was a lot of services that were moving to La Jolla who were no longer going to stay in Hillcrest. There were some that were going to be split between the two. So how you decided was an issue. And as much as we could, we gave people the choice. So we said we would always, we had to be a little careful of skills to make sure we had enough, people with enough experience in some of the specialties. But overall, we were able to say, okay, we're building this new place, and anybody who wants to can go. So apply, we did have to go through a whole, formal HR process because we are a union environment there. But we worked with the unions, we worked with the stewards from each of the units and tried to give them as much flexibility as possible. And then you do have to manage the people that are quote unquote left behind. And some of that, the managers did things like they'd have, new things on their unit that they would try to implement in the left behind group, or they'd have parties with everybody, or they would, have, some had to deal with having a whole brand new staff because nobody wanted to go. And they all stayed at Hillcrest. So I think it was the 5th floor that was an oncology unit. Karen started with all new staff.
Oh, wow.
Which was scary too, because she didn't have anybody that she knew until fairly soon before the opening, because you always had to manage your budget, so she had retreats for her new staff, and they got to know each other, because that bonding of your unit and your unit culture is really critical. So you're going to disrupt it no matter what. You're either going to disrupt it in the new place, you're going to disrupt it in the old place, or it's going to be a combination, and they're both going to be disrupted. So as much as we could, we tried to keep the manager over both of the units that were affected for as long as possible.
Mm-hmm.
And, because at least they knew the issues of both sides. And we had those managers work on the transition committees so that they knew what was happening. And, so.
Well, change is definitely difficult, I would say, and one of the most, difficult things that we deal with. So we use the ADCAR model, in terms of looking at awareness and the desire to change. And I would say for us, like, that reinforcement piece is our favorite part of that change management process, because you think like, okay, we've taught them, they know, they have the knowledge, but then they get into the new space and they're completely frazzled. And, going back in and saying, remember we talked about this. This was something that was was really important. So I think just, some of those highlights from a change perspective are certainly helpful.
And you can't underestimate that, because you think everything's going along, and then all of a sudden something will, it's that whole freezing, refreezing, and you're back and forth in that process until it's finally connected. And interestingly enough, I talked to somebody this week when I was at my own physician appointment who recognized me, and he was talking about he worked at Jacobs for quite after it was built. And he was telling me things that, seemed like good design, but they're finding their difficulty using it. And Stafford getting back into that, well, I wish we would have done this. And it's been 5 years. So you can't underestimate the amount of change and how that personally affects people. And then as a group, how that affects the group, so. And I think that's something that frankly I knew, but I wasn't always sympathetic to it.
Right.
Or, after a while, it's like, could you just get it? So it's you are going to move, got to work here. We got to figure it out. Come on, help us out, so.
Definitely exhausted. So you have had a lot of experience from a facility design, transition, and activation. So how did you manage the changes that, you come up with the design, and then along the way, I learned and you learned about value engineering, which, I feel like it's in the pure sense of what it's supposed to be, it's given a bad rap. But, all we ever feel is like, okay, you took away things that we thought were important. So how did you manage from the time of design to the time of activation, because especially in California, the process is so long because of OSHPD or HCI now and CDPH for us to get in. So how did you manage those changes in what that original design intent was, the ultimate design, and then how your team and the technology and stuff changes along the way?
Well, that is difficult. Well, with the cardiovascular unit, believe it or not, it took them 20 years to get that hospital up and running.
Oh, I did not know that.
Well, it's mainly because there was not, there wasn't a majority of people who felt the need for it to begin with. And it was very physician driven. So they were thinking, well, this is just self-serving for the physicians, when in fact it really was trying to coordinate all the care, but it took quite a while. So we went through several design phases during that period of time. Then once we finally made the decision to get that built, there were mostly equipment issues. That was a pretty interesting and I would say relatively easy activation, because it was all one service, and all those, cardiac, it was surgery and medicine, but it was all cardiac for the most part. And so that was a little easier to manage. So I would go to the department meetings and I would say, okay, this was what the physician department meetings, so this is what we started with, but now we're here. So let's talk about what the issues are. More than the design was the equipment issues. So they were changing cath lab equipment up to the last second. So that's very difficult for your training and for your staff learning and your training. So what we basically did was contract with the vendors for an extended period of time. So they were in the facility for longer than their normal, 2 or 3 days. We had them commit to somebody being in the building for a couple of weeks while we got everybody through the training, because we really couldn't do much before. So in order for it to be safer for the patient. So we managed that for CBC. For Jacobs, the initial design, can't remember how many years we started, to be honest with how many years before we opened that started, but there was no one left that was in the original design. except myself and a couple other, like I think even Mary Hakeem hadn't been involved. So even the director of women's hadn't been involved. I think Jan Heber had been there, the manager had been there, but staff were all different.
Oh, wow.
So unfortunately, it was kind of one of my lessons that I think about is the minutes of those design meetings really have to be detailed. And lots of times I think facilities leave that up to the architect or the facilities project manager, who may not understand the importance of some of the clinical. So luckily I had kept my own minutes on a bunch of the meetings. So I was able to go back and look through those, and then we would find them through the architect's, minutes. But there were so many of them that it's hard for them to call through them to see what was important. So we had to really start over again.
Oh,
then
wow.
we learned once it was built that it wasn't built to what our design was. And it had to do with, some of it had to do with the aesthetics, because they wanted this rounded building on the, and trying to put the rooms where the staff felt were the most functional didn't work with the columns that they had to put in.
Oh,
and the fire compartments, because of course a lot of those rules changed midstream. A lot of the OSHPD fire compartment rules changed midstream. So and I think there was only one physician who had been there and had been involved, and he was no longer in a leadership role. So, and he was, so he helped us, but it was still, we had to start over. So basically we put up the plans on the units as soon as we could get them. Which is hard because, that was one of the things I had to learn. Trying to read an architect's plan for nurses, doesn't always make sense. It looks like it's going to be a door there, but there's no door there, those kinds of things. Or it looks like this would be a hold open door, but it turns out it's not a hold open door. So the most effective I found was taking the plans, taking the latest minutes, going around to each of the units as much as I could, or making sure the managers were doing that to go through the new design. And it takes a lot of one-on-one, a lot of department meetings, a lot of, and the other piece is those mock-ups, I think, are very important. That actually helps staff see that, oh, this isn't going to fit, or this isn't going to be very functional, or this is better. And, that was hard to manage, because things that we identified in the mock-ups as issues didn't always get changed. So that's hard for staff to deal with. You ask our input and then you didn't take it. So, you always have to kind of understand why they didn't, why it wasn't implemented. And the leaders had to understand that to be able to explain to staff, this is why it was an infection control problem, or it was a fire code issue, or that kind of stuff. That was the most difficult.
I think sometimes though, I think this is my passion, is that there is that translation. And I do remember some of my very first meetings when I was at UCLA in the construction trailers, where I was like, I have no idea what they're talking about, because they had their own language. And then in the hospital, we have our own language. And then every organization that I work with has their own subculture language that they use. And so to take what I'm saying, thinking that I'm very clear with an architect, like maybe they the acronym or what I'm saying, they're thinking of that last project that they were on. So I think sometimes it really is just that validation in the loop of like, here's what they really mean, or here's what they're saying. So I do think documenting, as you mentioned, really is important to say, why certain things can't be the way they are. It doesn't necessarily help the end product, because, if there's a column in the middle of your room or in the middle of the department and you can't see around it from a visual perspective in an ICU, that's one of the big things is line of sight. So just being able to communicate those things, I think is really helpful. So we do have we started this because of this is probably that our assumptions document, and it's a decisions document. So we changed it from assumptions to decisions because, we would have liked to have this, but here's the end outcome and here's why. So it really is from the life of the project.
That document is critical. I think, I don't remember us having that when we did the cardiovascular. We probably did some, but it really made a big difference when we were at Jacobs, because we could go back and say, okay, this is when it was decided and who did it and this is why, and that helped.
I think, yeah, that was one of our first projects. And so I'd say, we've had so many lessons learned with you from the beginning and until now. So, and they don't end because, as you mentioned, like healthcare changes, and what happens in, San Diego or California doesn't work somewhere else. An academic medical center doesn't work for a community hospital. So all of those just different nuances need to be applied, and we live and die by our decisions.
And all of your best laid plans don't always work out. I mean, look at the past 2 years. Any facility that opened up in the past 2 years, probably had to do some changes based on the new infection control procedures and to adapt to COVID, and so it's going to happen. Something's not going to be the way you want it. You have to just figure out how best to communicate that and work with people to accept it and figure out. And I think the biggest thing is getting them involved in how is this going to, how can we work with this? I've said this to you guys, I think, in meetings, and I usually say it to the staff when I'm on one of your projects, and they'll say, well, we didn't want this, we have to move this. And then by that time it's way too late to move it, even if it's something as simple as your sharps container. And so I always say, okay, here's the deal. We just bought a brand new, beautiful house. We spent all our money on our new house, but we have no money for remodeling. We have to save up for that remodeling for later. And now we have to figure out how we're gonna live with our old curtains, because we can't afford our new curtains, or we can't afford that appliance. We're going to do this appliance. And so it's kind of a real life scenario that, everybody can relate to. So
I think definitely helpful to have, anecdotal stories like that to share to really help people understand, because I do think and you help us with the dress rehearsals as a project specialist, and you come in, and I was telling you earlier, we give you some of our more challenging units. And so from a preparation perspective, what are some of those things that you do to prepare when because when we come in, we walk the unit ahead of time, and we share with you all, here are the changes, here's how they're working today, here are the new changes, here's the equipment changes. But then you have your scenarios, and then you get your staff, and sometimes we have 30 departments going at the same time. So you're literally on your own. So what do you do to prepare when you're working with departments like that?
Well, we know we usually have scenarios ahead of time. Sometimes we don't. Sometimes we do. Sometimes it changes. You might have your assignment might change. But you always have something at least the night before, so that you can look at and be familiar with it and look at the floor plans. We always have a period of time we can go walk the area. I am very directionally challenged, so I don't really get much out of that. But I do notice a few things. And that's one of the ways I have the staff engaged to begin with, is when we're all in a group, I'll say, okay, somebody needs to lead because I have no idea where I'm going. And then, we kind of find it together. One of the big things I think with all of this is that we as facilitators have to be calm, act like we know what we're doing, even if we are not exactly sure. Look at the group, kind of read the room, see how things are going. Try to get as many people involved, try to get a communication pathway. So if you've got a big group, you have to kind of say, okay, let's everybody agree with, if I raise my hand or if I put up this card, that everyone's going to try to come together. So I don't have to be, come on, everybody get together. Sometimes that works, sometimes it doesn't. But the big thing to me is to be flexible and to see, so I know where I have to go and where I want them to be by the end of the day. And over and over again, I talk about, remember, if you're here on your first day and you have an emergency, you need to know how to get things fast, because you don't want to feel like you're letting your patients down. And that speaks to nurses. They don't want to do a bad job. They want to do a really good job. And they underestimate that newness of a building always. They go once to CT, oh, I'll know how to get there. So we always have multiple scenarios to go to the other departments to CT. And I just say, okay, let's go. And I make everybody go for the most part. And then they'll say, well, we know. I'll say, okay, well, I don't remember, so let's go. And sometimes they don't take the right route. And then they see, oh, I guess we didn't know, or, oh, we're not supposed to go that way. We're supposed to go this way. So I try to let them make some mistakes so that they see that they really do need to practice it over and over and over again, so they get that muscle memory. And if there's a disruptive group and you try to get, kind of get them where they're at. I had a rowdy group and we were in the PACU, and they had a lot of construction still going on. I mean, there were still wires hanging down at the door, and they didn't have the right patient assigned to the right room, and it was just not starting out good. So we went through the scenario, and they would want to be skipping past things, and I kept bringing them back. And so before we had lunch, I said, okay, let's talk about what we want to do for the afternoon. Is there something you want to change? Is there something you think this one nurse says, yes, it would be nice if we could just go through the scenario without being interrupted. I said, oh, okay, I guess you're referring to me. I just caught it. She says, well, yeah. I said, okay, well, then we'll do our first scenario that way. So of course we started, and then the staff got in, well, you forgot to do this, and you forgot to do this, and what about this, and what about that? So I let her go through the whole scenario. And then at the end I said, okay, well, did you think about this? Did you think about this? And then by the third one, we were all good. And they understand why I was interrupting them to ask them, well, can this reach, or do you know that this will fit? And so
I think it's hard because, we take people who are very skilled and very good at what they do, and then you put them in this new environment, and then they get lost, and they're flustered, and then it kind of comes off, like you say, we were like, oh, they kind of lose their focus. And so sometimes people aren't at their best. And I feel like, I like to say, hey, this is dress rehearsal. This is not your first day. So thank goodness this isn't a patient. Anytime you get flustered by something, or if you get lost, your staff is going to get lost, or your teammates are going to get lost. So you need to share those experiences with them. And I think for me personally, I'd say my other passion is wayfinding. So most of the time, there, at least in the last several hospitals we've done, there's no wayfinding for the staff. So, it's all back of the house. So the front of the house where all of the visitors go, it's beautiful, yes, gorgeous. There's artwork, and the back of the house is white walls, protective coverings, and it kind of all looks the same. And so the staff end up, going on those paths and getting lost. So, and they put up these really ugly signs, to help them kind of get to wherever they're doing. So, definitely. So. So in terms of skills, just from a project management perspective, because you've been the director of nursing over the whole hospital that's moving in. Are there any skills that you feel were the most valuable for you as you were doing your job as a director of nursing and then managing this building of the new Jacobs or Sulpizio?
So I think one of the keys is to build those relationships, or because I had those relationships, it was easier with other departments. It was easier for me to engage everybody in the project management. So understanding and respecting other departments and trying to make sure that their needs are met, as well as your own departments, your own, for me, it was nursing. So that was good. Flexibility, because there's always going to be something that doesn't go right.
Mhm.
And to always have in the back of your mind, and then as you get further down the road, written contingency plans. So what happens if we don't get the FTEs we thought we were going to get for EVS, and now we have 30 more beds, and how is that going to work, and how are things going to be managed, and really have some ideas of how your department then could pick up something or compromise with them on how things are going to be getting to be done. I would say learn things that you're not comfortable with as much as you can, because that helps you be more comfortable in new periods. So one of the biggest skills is to be okay with uncertainty. And that's the hardest thing for staff, I found over the years. They don't like not knowing exactly what's going to happen when. I think that's a nursing thing, frankly. And yet, I try to give them an example. I said, okay, you want to know all this, but when you come in the morning, yes, you have a plan for your patient. You're going to do this, 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 and that. But what happens if that plan goes awry and the patient deteriorates? You got to come up with that other
Plan B.
plan. So, you can't have specific certainty for every situation. You got to have some flexibility and have a plan B or a plan C, and maybe even more, depending on what's going on. So I think that tolerance for ambiguity and uncertainty is a key leadership skill that helps you in all of these projects. And that, as a project specialist, also helps. So, yeah, I might like to do ICU, but now I have to go to SPD, which I know very little about. Well, okay, so now I'm going to try to learn a little bit about that before I get there, and kind of keep my eyes open and do some management of the team versus have to know every little detail. So and I think resiliency of yourself and the ability to have energy and be excited about the environment you're in is key, especially for project specialists. You got to be the cheerleader. You can't be getting all freaked out about things. So.
Well, I know personally I've learned so much in this last year when we were at Hub in Pennsylvania and Philly. Nobody was with the parking people, and I was going to run down there to just help them get oriented. And I ended up spending like the entire scenario with them. I was just fascinated with their workflow and how they got all these cars up. And one of the things I never paid attention to, mostly because we never drove there, but to watch the valet service at that facility was just remarkable. I mean, these people are just constantly moving, and downstairs in the car park where you'd see them, valet parking these cars. I mean, it was just amazing. So all of these things we learned during these dress rehearsals.
Yes.
So.
Yeah, there's always something new. Every project has something new, and you see something different. That's what's fun about it for me. I get to see how different facilities worked, and even though I don't have the role of director anymore, I still keep in touch with people. So I'll say, hey, by the way, I saw blah blah blah. You might want to consider that. So it's nice.
Yeah, it's great to see best practices. So my final question for you is, if you're going to provide advice to somebody who either is going to go down director of nursing, or like a project manager, project specialist, what advice would you give that person?
I would say for either role that you should be open to new experiences. So if somebody offers you to be on a committee and you don't have the first thing knowledge about it, take it. And learn and keep your mind on lifelong learning, because that will always help you. And if you're curious, you will learn. So be curious, be open to new experiences. Try to get, you do need some organizational skills, which not always my strong suit. I like to leave things to the last minute, which is not good in a project management kind of an environment, but I have learned to be better at that over the years. That was one of my big issues in the CVC. Have fun, learn how to manage change, and learn how to work with different departments, and really be respectful of everybody, but really learn those departments, like spend a day. I always like to send staff to the other departments as well. So during their orientation, they went to the lab, watch how the lab works, so you understand why they might take another 5 minutes to get up to you one day because of this, that, and the other thing. I never suggested parking because that was always a big issue with us, but go to the OR, see what happens, and you'll understand why your patients are complaining of this kind of pain, because in fact, that wasn't where they were operating, but they had some strange board and their arm was in a weird position, or that kind of thing. So learn those other departments that you're going to have to interface with, and have them teach you, because it always is helpful to understand that.
I love that. And I wish, that really would be a part of everybody's orientation, because it took me quite a while. Now, I lived in Peds and PICU and went from the parking structure to my unit and back, and that was it, because it was nice at the beginning, and then I was, just working 12 hours, and you don't really want to do anything else besides go from your car back and forth. So having appreciation.
I always had the vision that I would like to somehow figure out how to get staff to be comfortable and allow staff to be comfortable rotating to other units, because I think it opens up your eyes. I never was totally successful. We did some with our intermediate units and ICU units, but if you work ortho, why not go work in general surgery for a month or two and get that experience? But it is hard to do with your staffing, but as much as you can, have people do, floating experiences where they feel safe. They have to go, that they're getting good care, team them up with somebody that's always helpful. So
it's happy. Yes. All right. Well, thank you, Debbie. And we're going to do a little bit of fun. So some rapid fire, just no wrong answers, whatever comes to your head or whatever you feel like sharing. That's what this is for. So you mentioned you came from the East Coast. So are you East Coast, West Coast preference?
San Diego preference.
Specifically.
Weather. it's only for the weather.
Yes. Oh, I mean, it is one of the greatest places in the world. And actually, several people have told me that. So, how about your favorite city in the world?
My favorite what?
City.
Oh, well, I loved New York when we were there. I kind of got an affinity for New York. So I would say probably New York.
It is a great city. How about the last craft that you made?
Baby blanket.
Ooh.
I crocheted a baby.
Yeah, I forgot about that. You have skills.
As a matter of fact, I think I have to get busy for Allie.
Yes, May. She's due a couple months.
I better hurry up.
Do you have a nickname?
Not anymore. I was Carrot Top, Freckle Face when I was growing up, but I have no nickname now. No.
And now everybody wants your hair.
Unless you gave me one I don't know about.
Well, we'll move on. How about your favorite comfort food?
I would say sweets, cake and cookies, that kind of stuff.
How about a dish that you cook best?
Best? Well, I've been vegan for 3 years now.
Oh.
And I make a vegan lasagna that's quite good. So
that sounds yummy.
Yeah.
So if you were going to write a book, what would the book be about?
I would never write a book.
How about a children's book? Instructional book?
No. I read a lot, but I would never want to write one. I
Oh,
just,
it's
too much,
it's
too much.
painful.
Yes, too
How
much,
about
too painful.
how about a word that you have a hard time pronouncing?
I never thought of that.
Mine is, and I can't say it, anemone.
Anemone?
And see, I think that's yours too. All right, my final question. How about your favorite food in Philadelphia?
My favorite what?
Your favorite food in Philadelphia?
I would say probably cheesesteaks.
We did get to go to a couple of really yummy places. So
Yeah, we went to a couple.
yeah. Chris finds them for us. So, all right. Well, thank you. I hope you enjoyed the tea. And if listeners want to get in touch with you, do you have a profile you can share?
Yes, it's Deborah, Deborah Wayne on LinkedIn.
Wonderful. Thank you so much.
I'm not totally timely about looking at it, but I'll try to be better now that I've done this.
Wonderful. Well, that's going to do it for this episode of Transition Tea. So on our next episode, we'll be joined by another healthcare leader to chat over a couple of best practices, pour over new insights, and then speak over our blend of transition and activation expertise. So thank you for listening. And if you want to hear more conversations like this one, please subscribe to Transition Tea wherever you get your podcasts. And if you want to see live videos of our recordings, you can follow us on our Yellow Brick YouTube channel. So until then, cheers. Thank you, Debbie.
Cheers. Thank you for having me.